Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to Let's Talk About It. I am so excited for you guys to be back, and I'm very, very excited for this week's episode specifically because it's something that I haven't done beforehand, but it's something that, I've been kind of just deep dive myself into the last couple of days. And so I really wanted to talk about this one with you guys, see what you guys think, and just kind of share my thoughts and opinions about it. So last week I was on Peacock, the streaming service, right? And I forgot exactly what it was that I was watching, but as I was watching it, an advertisement came up on there labeled Myth of the Zodiac Killer, right? Myth of the Zodiac Killer. Yeah, that one. And so it instantly just like gravitated or intrigued me because I think we've all kind of heard about the Zodiac Killer. He was in the news a couple of years ago, I think 2020, when, the FBI came out and confirmed that one other of his ciphers was actually decoded. And before that, I had already, seen a bunch of YouTube videos, some documentaries around the whole situation. I seen the movies, the movie with Jake Gyllenhaal, Mike Ruffalo. Great movie, by the way, if you guys haven't seen it. And so piqued my interest, right? Now, the Zodiac Killer, for those of you guys who don't know or maybe unfamiliar with it, was a suspect that committed some murders between December of 1968 to about 1969. There was, I believe, 7 people or 7 victims. 5 of them, unfortunately, did end up passing away because of this. And so not only did they commit these murders, but then what made it so intriguing is that this person started sending letters to different newspaper outlets, specifically with these ciphers, these codes, right? These code things, word searches, symbols that stood for words. And he demanded that they posted them online. And supposedly they were going to go ahead and reveal his identity. Very, very bizarre situation. Very tragic stories. And I think everything that I've kind of heard about the Zodiac Killer was always, I took it as, okay, yeah, he committed these 5 murders. He had these 7 victims. I took it as fact based on everything that, they had told me or everything that I had seen up to this point. So watching this documentary was very intriguing because obviously the name of it was The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. And again, you guys can find this documentary by yourself. It's on Peacock, the streaming services. Again, the name of it is The Myth of the Zodiac Killer. And basically, the whole point of this was there's a teacher out there who has this theory that the Zodiac Killer is actually a complete myth, right? Yeah, you've heard that correctly. It's a complete myth. He believes that the Zodiac Killer was either something that was invented by one of the actual murderers or actually one of the actual killers that, made this story up in order to try to deceive cops and to try to take the research or the investigation to lead towards himself. And then he even goes as far as to label that, the letters that were being sent out could have potentially came in from inside the actual newspaper and being one of the reporters who sent those directly to themselves to try to keep the story alive and to, get more news and get, further into his career, which is it's a pretty crazy thing, and just it's in my opinion. But they did label out a lot of good things or a lot of interesting theories on there, which leads me to believe that both things are true. And this is just my own personal opinion. I do believe that there was a serial killer by the Zodiac, right? That is known to us as the Zodiac Killer. But I also believe that maybe some of the crimes that are attributed to him could have been done by a copycat or somebody who was trying to prolong those things. And we're going to dive deep into each one of these cases and kind of talk about, what led me to believe my own theory, and then obviously discuss a little bit about what the documentary is. But people, let me just say that I saw the documentary, completely became intrigued around the case again, And I've spent the last couple hours doing massive research. I've gone and read every single police report on these cases. I read every single article. And that's another thing that I do want to go ahead and shout out is if you go and take a look at these police reports, and by the way, the website that I used was just the zodiackiller.com, and they're able to provide you with every single case, a summary around it, crime photos, police reports, and so shout out to that website. But the one thing that I did see right off the bat is that the police actually did do an amazing job at investigating. They followed up on many leads that were provided to them, did a lot of different interrogations, a lot of questionings to people all over the place. And so that to me was, wow, it did lead me to believe that it was indeed a Zodiac killer, but also trust wow, police actually are out there doing intensive work when it comes down to these things and not just saying, okay, we received these letters, it's this person. No, they've actually did a bunch of investigations that led them to rule out other suspects. And so this is where, I come in with my theory. But let's go ahead and start talking about the first two victims, right? So as I explained, the Zodiac Killer was somebody who murdered 5 people, 7 victims. 2 of them actually ended up surviving. But this all starts back on December 20th of 1968. On December 20th of 1968, the Zodiac Killer ends up killing 2 people, one of them by the name of David Arthur Faraday. He was only 17 years old, and Betty Lou Jensen, who was only 16 years of age at that time. They were killed in Lake Herman Road within the city limits of Benicia. And so the whole murder on this one specifically, it was these 2 young kids, 17 and 16, who went out on a date night. This was actually Betty Lou's first actual date. She actually did introduce them to her parents on there, which makes this story very, very tragic. But they're on their first date, and instead they told their parents they were going to be going out to a party, and then they would be home around 11 p.m. From police reports, they do acknowledge, multiple people acknowledge that they did spend some time at actually one of their houses, but they never really told them where they were going to be going on their actual date. Well, they end up parking their car in Lake Herman Road, right? They come into this area kind of known as Lover Lanes, where people go, sit in the car, talk a little bit, maybe do, other activities like kiss or snuggle or cuddle. But these 2 young kids end up parking their vehicle. A vehicle pulls up right next to them, and they begin to shoot. Now, David Arthur ends up getting shot, and his body was actually found right outside of the vehicle. Betty Lou Jensen body was actually discovered a little bit further away from the vehicle, as it looks like she actually did appear to run away from the situation afterwards, right, or after she heard some shots. Again, very, very tragic situation, and police go onto the case. They do start investigating. There's a lot of different, theories, because at this point, this murder by itself wasn't attributed to anybody. They really didn't know where this murder was coming from. Now, the documentary has this theory that this was potentially gang-related on retaliation towards David. So there was a story that David was actually at a diner, a luncheon, and he actually confronts a gentleman about selling dope or weed at his school and threatening to expose him. And because of this, the theory that the documentary presents is that, whoever it was that he tried to expose was the one that later on and did, retaliation onto him, finding his vehicle, shooting at him, and then killing both David and Betty. And he attributes this because he believes that there's 2 shooters. If you look at the police reports, you do see a lot of the gun shell casings were actually found near the bodies. However, one of the shells of casings was actually found on the opposite end of where the shooter or the suspect's vehicle would be at. So they believe there were actually 2 suspects. I don't necessarily believe or feel like that would actually be the case. I do think that this specifically was a Zodiac murder on there. I do believe that that second shell that he attributes to maybe being a second shooter could potentially be the Zodiac trying to follow Betty Lou Jensen, as she was trying to go ahead and run away from the crime scene. And so after reading the police reports, they did, the police actually does mention the alterations at the diner. They did follow up. They weren't able to, attribute anything to it. They went on and they went to go ahead and speak to a lot of just people that were with them through high school, to both of their parents, to see if there was any, threatening or anybody that wanted to cause their kids any harm. But both of them were honestly just good high school teenagers that didn't deserve this at all. There was nothing that you can pinpoint and saying like that potentially could have happened, except the story of David trying to expose somebody on there. However, when police try to follow up on that lead, they weren't able to discover anything around it. So I do feel that this one here is the very first murder of the Zodiac Killer. Now, time goes on, and the second killing actually happens roughly about 7 months later. The second on there happened on July 4th of 1969, and this unfortunately was from Michael Renault McGue, who was about 19 years of age, and then Darlene Elizabeth Farron, who was 22 years of age at the time. They were parking they were the same kind of MO. A couple or two individuals on there, male and female, parked. They were actually in a parking lot in Blue Rock Springs Park in Vallejo. The gentleman, the 19-year-old kid, McGue, actually does end up surviving this attack on there. Unfortunately, Ferris was pronounced dead upon arrival at Kaiser Foundation's hospital. Now, because McGue actually did survive this, they were actually able to interview him. And his story is that both himself and Darlene were sitting in the parking lot, listening to music and speaking, and a car parks right behind theirs as well. Again, very similar MO to the very first one. Parks for a little bit and then drives away. About 5 to 10 minutes later, a second vehicle comes in and parks directly behind them. However, after the second vehicle parks there, somebody walks out from the actual car and starts to shine a very light bright. Now, both of them suspected that this could potentially be a police officer, right? Shining a flashlight towards them and trying to identify them or just, speak to them onto why is it that they were parked, in this parking lot at a later time of the night. So because of this, because they believe it's officers, Michael actually starts to go into his wallet to bring out his identification. And as the light gets closer to the vehicle, he starts hearing muffled sounds, and then he begins to feel pain around his chest and his back. Obviously, these were shots that were happening towards the vehicle. Again, very, very similar MO to the first incident, where it was a young couple who was sitting down in an isolated area. Vehicle comes in, parks, begins to shoot. Big thing on here, no word were ever spoken on any of these two. They weren't able to get a glimpse of who it was that was shooting at them. But again, shots were fired, came directly up to the vehicles and just began to shoot. Then came in a little bit later and they actually saw Michael down. They ended up driving away, calling the cops, and then, coming back into the scene, and then the cops were able to discover both of them on there. Both of them were rushed to the hospital, and like I mentioned, unfortunately, Darlene ends up dying because of this, but Michael does survive the incident. Now, this is where it begins to correlate, or once a suspect of the Zodiac Killer becomes into play. Because after this incident, or after this murder attempt, there was a police dispatcher who ends up receiving a phone call from a payphone, and the voice on there states, if you drive up and if you go into a parking lot of Blue Rock Spring Parks, you are going to see 2 dead kids. And he finishes off the sentence with, I also killed those 2 kids back in December. Once they traced it again, this voice call was then traced to a payphone, and when they arrived, the payphone was just, it was not hanging from the actual place, it was just simply dangling around. Again, police report states that they did find a payphone. They actually did try to fingerprint it. Nothing on there, unfortunately, ever came back. Now, for this one here, the documentary again states that if you look further into it, they attribute this to be Darlene's ex-husband, or who they believe was Darlene's ex-husband. Darlene had actually been married twice. She married a gentleman, followed him out to a different place in the United States because he did get a job. Their divorce, or their life isn't working out very well, and so they actually end up coming back to San Francisco, where they were living in a motel for a little bit. She starts working at a diner, a lunch area, falls in love with the cook, and ends up divorcing the first husband, marrying the second husband. And there was, the documentary attributes as in the first husband would follow her around, was a little bit of a stalker, and then they state that there was some, physical abuse that ended up happening. The documentary also is able to discover and find the location of the ex-husband, who they suspect could potentially be the killer, and they actually interview him as well. Now, he states in the documentary that he did not know about Darlene's murder until one day he gets stopped by the police because he doesn't have his driver's license on them. They provide him a court date. He shows up to the court to provide his driver's license, and when he turns around, there's a massive sea of police people on there waiting for him. Now, his story matches up with what's on the police report itself, because the police did actually end up getting a tip that potentially it could have been her ex-husband. This came directly from Darlene's family because they never really liked the guy and they got some weird vibes from him. Police did end up trying to locate him. They got a wisp that he, ended up getting a traffic violation, that he was going to be in court, and so they did set up a perimeter in order to go in and arrest him, because they actually were treating the case as if he was the actual Zodiac Killer. And they investigate him for hours. They check out his alibis, and they were actually able to go ahead and dismiss him of being the Zodiac Killer. Now, there was a couple of things that did correlate on there. Her ex-husband was in the military at a given point. He was actually a fan of cryptography, right? So writing those ciphers that the Zodiac ends up, calling out. But basically, his alibi, as stated in the document, was that in the 4th of July, he actually drove out to the woods with his new wife, and they took acid, and they were on an acid trip, basically just kind of wandering around. They ended up running into a family out in the woods, and he waves at them and says, "Hey, hello." Family on their waves back. And supposedly, the family that he ran to in the woods was a federal judge. And so a federal judge basically said, yes, I did see him out in the woods. And because of that, they ended up dismissing him. I wasn't able to find anything of that to corroborate it through the police report itself, and neither was the documentary. But for some reason, throughout the whole police report, they weren't able to, they didn't want to investigate him further. And again, the police report not only were focusing on him, they were focusing on other potential suspects around the situation, friends, other guys. It seems like Darlene might have had multiple gentlemen that she was speaking to. For example, Michael, who was in the vehicle, was not her boyfriend. She was married to said cook that I mentioned a little bit earlier. The cook was interviewed. Her husband of the time of her passing was interviewed, and he said that, hey, he didn't really like to go out that much, and she really enjoyed to go out. She really enjoyed to dance. And so he had actually met Michael, and that it was, agreement between them that, hey, my wife likes to go out and dance. You like to dance as well. So by all means, you can go ahead and pick her up. And you guys can go out on these, on these dates, or go out dancing and so forth. So this one to me also seems to have been the Zodiac Killer. Now, why do I say this? Not only did that phone call ended up appearing, the MO, or the way that both crimes came about, was exactly the same, right? Two young people somewhere in a parking lot away from a lot of others. Vehicle pulls up, shots are fired. Not only that, the phone call that was made, and then when the letters actually started arriving, right? Again, I told you that the Zodiac ended up sending, letters out. The letters that he sent out to multiple of these newspapers said, hey, please publish this. I am the person who killed the young kids back in December of 1968, and also, the kids in 4th of July. And to prove this, I'm gonna go ahead and provide you with information that only myself and the police would actually know. And so he ends up providing, the type of ammunition that was used on the killings, where the bodies were located or how the bodies were discovered. And so the documentary itself never tries to go against this or try to figure out how they ended up getting this information. They actually don't talk about that at all, which I found to be very, very, very shocking. So to me, that states on there that it was the same individual. Same MO ends up happening to both of them. And then the letters on there was able to provide information that only police would have at that given time, right? And so who else would know the information, like the location of the body, the ammunition that was used in the case, other than the killer himself, right? So that to me on there, I think ties both of these up. As the Zodiac Killer himself, I do believe that he ended up committing these murders. I do believe that the first letters that were sent out and that the ciphers that were sent out were actually from the same person. Now, these next ones are where it starts to get a little bit different and where I do see the possibility of these being attributed to copycats or other persons that were trying to mimic him and then just trying to pin it on the Zodiac Killer. The third string of murders end up happening in September 27th of 1969. Only a couple of months, later, 2 months later, than the incidents of the 4th of July. This one here, unfortunately, ended up happening to Brian Calvin and Cecilia Ann Shepard. Brian was about 20 years age at the time, and Cecilia was about 22. Now, both of these individuals were stabbed. They were stabbed at Lake Berryessa in Napa County. Brian does end up surviving the incident. Unfortunately, Cecile Shepard does end up passing away because of her injuries a couple days later in about September 29th. In this one here, again, you do have Brian who ends up surviving this murder attempt, right? He states that both himself and his girlfriend, wanted to go out. Lake Berryessa was a place where, obviously, it's a lake, but there was also these grass areas with trees that were covering around. They set up a blanket, and they're basically laying down. A couple of minutes into it, I believe Cecile ends up noticing a figure around the trees, or kind of just looking around. They believe that it could be other personnel or other people, and so they, don't really pay too much attention to it. At a given point, though, this gentleman comes out and reveals himself, the gentleman that they saw kind of lurking in the trees. Now, again, Brian is the person who's recollecting all of this because Brian does end up surviving the attacks and was able to provide, his full testimony of the events. A gentleman comes out from behind a tree, and he is actually, covered in basically like a cloth mask that came down, covered his entire head, and then covered down kind of like this area, the torso area. And towards the middle of it was the symbol that was being sent out in those letters, which is a tribute to the Zodiac sign, which is basically a circle and a line that's going down to it. Now, this individual comes out with the mask placed on there, and he has a gun and a knife and pieces of rope as well. This time here, though, the killer actually has a conversation with them and says, hey, don't be scared. I am a prisoner who escaped from a prison, and I'm trying to get away. I need a new car, so I need your keys, and I need all the money that you guys have. Brian says, I don't have a lot of money on me. I have some loose change in my pockets that you're more than welcome to have, but let me try to see if I can maybe help you. The killer on here does not want that, and he basically demands that Cecilia ends up tying up Brian. So he throws a rope at them. Cecilia ends up tying up Brian, and after Cecilia has tied him up, the killer then moves on and, ties up Cecilia himself. At this point, he brings out a knife and begins to stab Brian. He was about to stab Cecilia, but Brian actually said, "No, please stab me first. I can't bear the sight or the hearings of you doing any damage to her." So he begins to stab Brian. Brian plays dead after a couple of stabs, and then he proceeds to move on to Cecilia, I'm sorry. After he's done with the murder, he simply just walked away, goes right to the very top, disappears, right? Now, he does end up finding the vehicle of Brian and Cecilia, and this is the reason why they attribute this attack to the Zodiac Killer as well, because engraved in the car on there with either a felt pen and one of the doors, he ends up writing the date of December 20th, 1968, July 4th, 1969, and then September 27th, 1969 at the very, very bottom. It's weird to say that the way that the dates were written, the first two were written out in just complete numbers, right? So he had 12, 20, 68, then he had 7, 4, 1968, and then for September, he actually wrote out SEP 27, 1969. Another phone call is made to the police where they say, "Hey, if you go to this specific location, you're going to find, 2 other individuals." Now, this one here is a little bit weird. There's a little bit of doubt to myself that this could potentially be the Zodiac, because I feel like the MO just completely changes on this one. This is no longer somebody coming up and just shooting at 2 people. This is somebody who now is covering their face, right, into a hooded area with symbols, and then he ends up stabbing the victims. Not only that, but also proceeds to have a full-blown conversation with them prior to the actual events, which had never happened beforehand. Now, there was 3 college girls that were around the area as well, and that they actually saw this gentleman. They actually did meet up with police, and they actually provided the descriptions of the person who they saw, and the descriptions ended up making a sketch, or artist sketch about the suspect. The suspect sketch that came out for this one looks nothing like the subject sketch that is kind of now famously known as the Zodiac Killer. Slimmer body, glasses, wrinkles up top, with parted hair. Again, very infamous. You can kind of see it if you actually go onto just Wikipedia and you put the Zodiac Killer. This suspect image is the one that's on there. The suspect viewing of the one that ended up happening in Lake Berryessa looks nothing like that. It's more of a rounded shape. It looks a little bit more of a cartoonish sketch of an individual, and so it's hard. I believe, if I really think about it, I don't believe that this itself was the Zodiac Killer. I believe that this could potentially have been somebody that started seeing the crimes that were occurring, went on and felt that maybe he could do the same, and then in order to get away with it, ends up, just simply putting these symbols or these dates on the car itself and trying to lead police to the Zodiac Killer, right? The person who had committed the murders, in order for him to get away with this murder itself. This one here, they did some research and they couldn't really find out much of Brian or Cecile, and then Brian ended up surviving this one, so there's nobody that they can really attribute to who would try to do them any harm. But I don't believe that they were necessarily targeted or that they were attempted to be murdered specifically for a reason. I think it was just a copycat that came out and tried to mimic the Zodiac and then attribute the killings to the Zodiac himself. Now, the last one that ends up happening is the murder of Paul Lee Stein, right? Paul Lee Stein was actually 29 years of age at the time, and he was actually shot and killed on October 11th of 1969 in Presidio Heights in a neighborhood up in San Francisco. For this one here, the murderer ends up ordering a taxi cab, gives him a destination. Once he arrives at the destination, actually pulls out a gun, takes a shot. Now, there was 2 kids that were right in front of where the crime ended up happening, and these are the 2 kids that presented them with the sketch of who the Zodiac, right, or the individual for this murder was. They stated that after shooting the Paul Lee Stein on there, the murderer gets out of the vehicle, goes to the side of the drivers with a white handkerchief, starts to scrub away any of his fingerprints, and then he goes into the actual cab one more time, robs Pauline Stein of his wallet and some of his belongings, but also tears off a piece of clothing from him as well. After that, he ends up basically just walking a specific direction. Now, it's to note that in one of the letters that the Zodiac ends up sending he states that police actually could have caught him on this event because he was actually stopped by a policeman. However, the information that was being passed around was unfortunately incorrect or not good at that time, because when they were providing with the MO or the characteristics of the individual or the suspect at the time, they stated that it was going to be a white Caucasian male that the kid saw. I don't know where the communication ended up being wrong, but other police were receiving that the individual that they were looking for was an African-American male. And so this cop who ends up stopping a Caucasian gentleman who was around the area lets him leave because he didn't fit the description that he had received. Come to find out later, the description obviously was incorrect. And then the Zodiac goes on and mocks them with a letter that he sends out to the publication later. Now, the way that this here was attributed to the Zodiac as well is another letter sent out to a newspaper, specifically San Francisco Chronicles, and he says, "Hello, I am the Zodiac Killer. I was the one who committed that murder of the taxi cab driver, and to prove that it was me, here is a piece of its clothing." And so police ended up recovering the piece of the clothing. They compared to the clothes of Paul Lee Stein, and it matches completely. Not only was the fabric correct, the pattern was correct, but itself also had blood patterns on there, or blood smears, and they actually matched up as well to the shirt that Paul Lee Stein was holding at that time. And so this one here, again, a little bit different, but I do believe that this one was attributed to the Zodiac himself. And the reason why I believe that this one here was attributed to the Zodiac as well is, again, the kind of the MO is once again correct, where he just simply takes a shot at an individual with not much speaking or results. But then obviously he sends out the letter with the pieces of clothing on there. And you notice that in the first 2 murders, right after he sent out a letter to the newspapers, he also stated, "Hey, I'm going to provide you with information so that you can make sure that it was me who did those." So obviously you're dealing with somebody who is very intellectual, somebody who wanted to go ahead and take, prize for or claim for the actual murders. And so I think that's what he ended up doing with Paul, taking a piece of his shirt, sending it out to making sure that, hey, you guys know that it was myself on here. So to sum it all up, I think that the documentary presents a very, very interesting, compelling theory that the Zodiac itself was just a complete myth. I do believe that they go a little biased on the documentary just to simply try to prove the point that they're trying to come across, that, hey, it is a myth. I don't believe that it's a complete myth myself. I do believe that there was a Zodiac Killer out there. However, I think it is very curious that at least one of the cases that is, so widely confirmed to be his is so different than anything else that he ever did. Not just that, the sketch, right, of the suspect that committed the murders out in Lake Bayesa of Brian and Cecilia is completely different of the sketch that we all kind of considered to be the Zodiac Killer, right, or the most accurate description of the Zodiac Killers from the 2 kids who ended up seeing the gentleman kill Paul Lee Stein. And it just leads me to believe, like, how could the same person who committed both of these, right, look so different in just a matter of 2 months? Not just that, how can how can their MO completely change? How can you go from shooting people to stabbing people? How do you go from not having conversations with your victims to trying to, correlate or say that you're a escaped prisoner, that you need help and you need money, and then not take any money after that ends up happening, tying people up, and then stabbing them on there. It looks, and not just that, also wearing a full mask, because the other three, there was no mask on there, and they speak to a psychologist, and this I will say this about the documentary. The documentary does try to prove or speak to people who have the opposite view, but I do believe that when people have made their minds on something specifically, it's very, very hard to disprove it. And so I think that you have those people who believe the Zodiac Killer is responsible for all of these murders, all of them were his. And then you have, these individuals now over here who believe it's a complete myth. Why not kind of meet in the middle, which is what I kind of think ends up happening here, and say that yes, there was indeed a Zodiac Killer, because 3 of those cases are very, very similar on the things that he was doing. However, one of them does seem to be completely different than the rest of them. In so many different ways. And so I think because of that, I don't believe that the murders that ended up happening in Lake Berryessa were made by the Zodiac Killer himself, but a copycat or somebody trying to attribute the killings to the Zodiac in order to try to get away with those murders, or somebody who was fascinated by what was happening, and wanted to, have his scene come out on TV and so forth. But it's a very, very, very compelling theory, right? What do you guys believe? What do you believe happened? Do you guys know who the Zodiac Killer is? What do you feel of this? Have you checked out the documentary? And what were your thoughts? And if you haven't checked out the documentary and you're a fan of true crimes, this is definitely one that I feel like you should check out. It brings in some very compelling theories around it. And then you can make your mind on, what do you think ended up occurring? But again, a very, very, very interesting case. To this day, it remains a cold case. It was something that was never solved. And so it's crazy, it's crazy that these individuals are out there, that these events end up happening. And I think at the very end, the only thing that we can do is, feel for those families who were impacted by this, because they also speak to the loved ones of certain of them, whether it was friends of like Betty Lou Jensen, whether it was a sister of Darlene, or her, husband at the time. And they're still dealing with the pain. They're still dealing with the grievance, the loss of a loved one who they thought they were going to be able to spend the rest of their life with, or at least have them for those life moments, and they're no longer there. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is remembering those people who were killed during these events. Remember them, and really be there for their family members at the end of the day, because they're still dealing with the events that ended up happening on there. Again, thank you to the myth of the Zodiac for coming out, and Peacock for having it, because it was a really, really good, well put documentary. But it brings in a new theory to what could potentially happen. And I think at the end of the day, that's intriguing. And I think it's good that we have these conversations, or that things like these documentaries do come out, because it could potentially shed light and try to open up this case. And maybe if we start investigating other individuals that were in that area, not trying to just link it up specifically to one murderer like the Zodiac, then maybe we can discover who that other individual was. And maybe we can go ahead and give closure to those family members. But again, thank you guys so much for checking this episode out. I know it's a lot different than what we typically do on here, but it was just something that I saw, and that I kind of, have been doing so much research and deep diving into this. And so, I definitely just wanted to come out here, provide you guys with my opinions, my theories. And at the end of the day, people, these are just my theories and my opinions. You can agree, disagree with them. And I think that's the beautiful thing of having conversations, is that you can. And, if you do, by all means, leave a comment, or let me know, because I think, having a conversation is the best thing, instead of trying to fight on who's right or who's wrong. Let's focus on that. Let's just focus on, open-ended conversations, and that could potentially lead to better than things. So thank you guys so much. I'm just rambling here at the very end, but thank you guys so much for checking out this episode. Thank you guys for tuning in. And yeah, we'll be back next week with another episode of Let's Talk About It. So you guys have a great rest of your week, people. Thank you.